My name's Emily Schaffner. I'm going to be doing analysis of the hip joint and knee joint during a soccer kick. I broke it down into 3 phases. You have the backward phase or the wind up, and then you have the acceleration and the follow through. And I will be focusing on the lace kick because there's multiple different kinds of kicks, but that one's the most commonly used to dribble and to shoot and stuff like that. So the first phase is starting in anatomical position. You have both of your toes pointed forward. I'm just going to stand sideways so you can see the movement. And it ends with a slight extension of the hip and a flexion of the knee. The extension of the hip, those primary movers are going to be the biceps femoris and the gluteus maximus. They're concentrically contracting to flex the thigh at the hip joint. And then the other movers would be the posterior fibers of the gluteus medius and minimus, the adductor magnus, the semitendinosus, and semimembranosus. And those are all also extending the thigh with concentric contraction. The antagonists of that are, the primary antagonists are the rectus femoris and the psoas major and minor muscle, as well as the iliacus muscle. Those are all passively lengthening. And then there's also the anterior fibulars of the gluteus medius and minimus, and the tensor fasciae latae, the sartorius, and the pectineus. Those are all also passively lengthening. And then for the flexion of the knee, you have the primary movers being the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and semimembranosus, and those are also concentrically contracting. And then you have the gastrocnemius, the plantaris, the sartorius, and the gracilis. Those are all also flexing the leg at the knee joint. Your antagonists for the flexion of the knee are the quadriceps. Those are passively lengthening, so that's your rectus femoris, your vastus lateralis, medialis, and intermedius. Start with the end of phase 1. So the second phase is the acceleration. It starts with that extension of the hip and flexion of the knee, and it ends with a slight hip flexion and then a slight knee extension when you make contact with the ball. There's also some plantar flexion in the ankle joint, but we're not going to focus on that. So the thing about this is your knee is still flexed, but it is more extended. So in the hip flexion, your primary movers are the rectus femoris, which is the only muscle of the quadricep group that actually flexes the hip. And the psoas major and minor muscles and the iliacus, those are all concentrically contracting. And then some of the other movers are the anterior fibers of the gluteus medius and minimus, the tensor fasciae latae, the sartorius, the pectineus, and the adductor longus and brevis. And those are all flexing the thigh through concentric contraction. Your antagonists for this are the gluteus maximus. That's your primary antagonist. That's what does all the the extension in the hip. So it's passively lengthening in the flexion of the hip. Your biceps femoris are also passive lengthening. And then some other antagonists are the posterior fibers of the gluteus minimus and medius, the adductor magnus, and the semitendinosus and semimembranosus. And then for the flexion of the knee, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So for the flexion of the knee, your primary mover is the rectus femoris, the vastus medialis, lateralis, and intermedius. However, instead of a passive lengthening in the antagonists, which are the hamstrings, the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris are the hamstring group, those are all eccentrically contracting, only because we still have that flexion in the knee. So those muscles are still generating a force, which is why they're eccentrically contracting when you're still extending that knee, because at this position, all of those muscles are contracting either concentrically or eccentrically in order to keep this position. Phase 3 is going to begin at the end of phase 2, which is that slight flexion of the hip and then the slight extension of the knee, and it's going to end while it's ending after you kick the ball. So when you kick it, you're going to have your leg like this, almost perfectly straight. You have a flexion at the hip and then you have a full extension at the knee. So here the flexion of the hip is the same primary movers as before, so the psoas major and minor, the iliacus, the anterior fibers of the gluteus medius and minimus. All the stuff mentioned before is still the primary movers at this point. And they're actually doing an isometric contraction as opposed to a concentric, because at this point, this position, your hip did not move from the previous phase. So when you're doing this, here's the beginning or the end of the second phase and the beginning of the third. And then the end of the third is just that finishing the extension of the knee. So when you do it at the third position, there's actually isometric contraction instead of concentric contraction in the movers. Your antagonists are all the same as well. You have the gluteus maximus, the hamstrings, the posterior fibers of the gluteus minimus and medius, the adductor magnus. All of that is still going to be the primary antagonists. However, they are now eccentrically contracting because you also at this point have gravity as an antagonist, which is trying to push your leg down to the ground. So that eccentric contraction is helping resist the gravity and lift your leg up off the ground to maintain that position. So then you have the full extension of the knee also at the phase 3. That's going to go from that slight flexion that we ended at in phase 2, and it's going to go to the full flexion at the end of phase 3. And once again, all those primary movers are the same. It's the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, medialis, and intermedius. And those are all extending the leg at the knee joint. And then you have your primary antagonists, which are the hamstrings, the semitendinosus and semimembranosus, and then the biceps femoris. And those are all your primary antagonists, but then you also have the gracilis, the gastrocnemius, the sartorius. Those are all also some antagonists there. The difference here, though, is those antagonists are actually passive lengthening in the knee joint, because if you were to stand in anatomical position and you just flex your hip, your foot is going along for the ride as you flex your hip. So with those antagonists there, the antagonists in the hip joint are actually doing all of the work against the gravity. Your foot's just going along for the ride. There's no extra movement there. So that's why they're passive lengthening as opposed to eccentrically contracting. So just to summarize, we're gonna have a full soccer kick with the laces, where there's that plantar flexion in the ankle as opposed to any abduction or adduction. So it's gonna start in anatomical position, which is the first phase, and then the first phase ends in the hip extension and the flexion of the knee. And then your second phase is going to begin in the same position, and it's going to end with a hip flexion and a slight extension in the knee, still holding that flexion. So there's eccentric contraction in the antagonist, concentric contraction in the movers. And then it's going to end with phase 3, which starts here, and the end is just a simple full extension of the knee, where all of your movers in the thigh are now isometrically contracting, and the antagonists are eccentrically contracting to resist this gravity here. And then you have the same prime movers in the knee, and all of your antagonists are passively lengthening because they're going along for the ride. They don't need to have any extra eccentric contraction to beat that gravity there. So a full soccer kick is going to look like this. And you can see all of those ranges of motion while you do it. And if you do it slow, you can see each phase happening. So yeah, that's it.